Super Bowl Sunday is easily identified as an event that captures just about everybody's interest because it is a consummate game of America's favorite sport. According to columnist George Will, it's also easily identified as the highest calorie consumption day in America. Next to Thanksgiving, another big football day. What is it about football that makes us want to eat so much anyway? It's also easily identified as an event that's truly representative of America. So said the same columnist, George Will. Where else could you find a game played indoors in the air conditioning on grass in a desert? It's also a day when corporations, as we know, invest millions to get their product in front of approximately, they say, about 112 million viewers this year. Companies like Toyota, Kia, BMW, T-Mobile, McDonald's, Mountain Dew, Skittles, Snickers, Nissan, and a company named Morphe that is promoting a remote phone charger. God's gift to us all. All these corporations will invest about $4.5 million in just one 30-second spot. As the Super Bowl is easily identified as uniquely American, so are you and I easily identified by what we say and by what we do. Peter discovered this in the courtyard on the night of Jesus' arrest. In our lesson from Matthew, highlighting Peter's denial of Jesus 3 times, Peter was not only guilty by association, he was also guilty by the region from which he came, Galilee, the northern area of Palestine, rich with rich grain and grass in the valleys, with pomegranate and olive and other fruit orchards, all well watered by streams. But it was also an area where people would look down upon with patronizing contempt by their more pure-blooded and strictly Orthodox brother Jews in Jerusalem, according to one commentary. Galilee is the same region where Jesus recruited his earliest disciples, including Peter. No doubt that most of these guys, it's pure speculation, most of these guys probably had a chip on their shoulder, considering the disparagement they received at the hands of the purebloods from the south, which perhaps made them even more eager to align themselves on the side of the Messiah. We would never know all the reasons that the disciples made the decision and dropped their nets and dropped their families to follow a man they didn't even know. But these are the mysteries that attend our birth and our growth. So writer John Irving. But back to the impetuous Peter, who the night of Jesus' arrest, as we have read many times before, he cut off a Roman guard's ear, and then was equally impetuous in his race to deny Jesus in the courtyard, a place by which Peter will always be identified. When you consider the facts of the night, it seems to me that Peter really had more to lose by denying Jesus than he had to lose by remaining loyal to him. What would follow after Peter's denial of Jesus was living in fear in the underground that he would ultimately be discovered by the authorities, and then living in guilt that he had denied his relationship with his own Messiah. But Peter resurrected, as we know, his reputation and his redemption later on, and on his own road to his own personal cross. But when one really thinks about it, Peter is not necessarily identified by what he did after the cross, but he is primarily identified by what he did before the cross in that courtyard when he denied Jesus 3 times. Peter's situation illustrates how easy it is to be identified by something you do. In this case, it was a singular act of denial. And you and I are easily identified by what we do. If you're ever in the Pittsburgh airport, you will notice a statue, a former Steeler running back, Franco Harris, who is in his famous catch position. Never mind that distraction next to him. The Immaculate Reception, as it is called, is a football that deflected off an Oakland Raider defensive back and was caught by Franco Harris right before it hit the ground, and he caught the pass, raced on the sidelines into the end zone, giving the Cedars their first playoff victory in who knows how many years. It is arguably the most famous play in NFL history. But Mr. Harris is identified less for his Hall of Fame abilities than he is for that one play. You think of Franco Harris, you think of that one play. It's the first thing that comes to your mind. Okay. But normally, in our normal day-to-day living, since our chosen occupations are so much a part of our lives, we are primarily identified, and you all will be identified when you get into your careers, into your occupations as students, by what you do every day from 8 to 6, whether you like it or not. He's a financial advisor. He's a doctor. He's a nurse. She's a lawyer. He's a coach. She's an architect. He's a dentist. She's a pastor. He's an elected official. She's a musician. He's in sales. She's a homemaker. He's in administrative management. He's a professor. He's in computers. He's a soldier. She's a journalist. The players on the Super Bowl stage today will be primarily identified by the fact that they play professional football. When the names Tom Brady and Russell Wilson are mentioned, the first thing that comes to anybody's mind is not who they are, what their character is, and so on. The first thing that comes to mind is that they are an NFL quarterback. By the way, after I showed the Tom Brady 60 Minutes clip last Sunday, a Seattle Seahawks fan came up to me and said, "I want equal time." But the goal of a Christian is to be identified as a Christian first, and then everything else comes after that. In order to assure equal time to that one parishioner, Seattle's quarterback, Russell Wilson, a Christian himself, uses John 3:30 as his guiding light. He must become greater, I must become less. He must become greater, I must become less. And it is true that with this attitude that we flip things around to reflect the source of our identities. And interesting enough, yours and my faith are identified not only by what we say and by what we do, but it's also identified by the burdens that we elect to carry in our own personal walk, in our own Christian faith. Quite simply, if in our faith we are not willing to share a burden, if we're not willing to share a burden, then our faith is not easily identified. Going back to what you do. Paul says in our Galatians message, carry each other's burdens, and in this way you will fulfill the law of Christ. Each one should test their own actions. They can take pride in themselves alone without comparing someone to someone else. For each one should carry their own load. I've always appreciated this passage because it talks about taking pride in yourself alone, who you actually are. And one of the ways to do this is to identify yourself first as a Christian. And in order to identify yourself as a Christian, one has to offer his or her evidence of his or her faith. And that will usually require some sort of sacrifice. What did James say? Faith without works is quite dead. Dead on arrival, I would add. You know, we don't expect to get anywhere in life unless we sacrifice something along the way, do we? Many of you have told me about your own professional pursuits. How much time and effort it took you to get yourself to the point where you are today. The sacrifices, the burdens, the commitments, the doing without things in order to get ahead. All these were necessary to help you become who you are today. All these things were necessary to help you pursue the dreams you had always held in your heart and in your mind. All these things were necessary to help you realize the vocation and your profession that you are in. The same principles apply to the Christian faith. Last May, Mitt Romney spoke to the students at Brigham Young University, and although he came at it from his own particular Mormon emphasis, his words are useful to every Christian. He said to the student body at BYU, there may be times in your life where you may feel it is a bit of a burden to be a member of a church. They went on to say that the relationships, though, that you share with one another are worth every single burden you carry. So that brings us the first of two questions. What is it about your life that stands out as uniquely Christian? Is your faith easily identified? Could you be picked out in a crowd, just like Peter was picked out in the crowd, in the courtyard? Or is it camouflaged by everything else that's going on in your life? What stands out in your life that is evidential of your faith? Or is it ethereal enough only to resemble your expectations for the next life and not your expectations for this one? There are a lot of examples one can offer, but one of mine that comes to mind is a young man who approached me one day at a church, at my former church in Michigan. He said to me, he said, Cam, he said, I'm not doing anything. I'm not involved in anything. My faith is not being manifested in any way. What can I do? And I know that I have a gift for young people. I know I can strongly connect to young people. We happen to have an opening for a middle school teacher, and that segment of the population was burgeoning in that church at that particular time. So the job was his. And I was sharing with a couple just the other day that every Sunday, Scott would walk into that classroom and he'd plop $25 right on the table. And he'd say to the 7th and 8th graders, which one of you guys want to go to the convenience store next door and buy the snacks for our Sunday school class? Well, 100% of them raised their hands every Sunday, of course. But the word soon got out that not only was there a feast going on every Sunday in middle school class, but what he was saying was interesting and relevant to where those kids were at in their lives today. In a crowd, you see, Scott could be picked out as one who wanted to make a difference in the lives of middle school students. The answer is pretty simple. If you are a Christian, then I need to be identified as a Christian. You and I need to be picked out in the crowd, just as Peter was. If you claim to be a Christian, then you need to be easily identified as being a Christian by something you do. A Roman Catholic bishop from the African country of Ghana said, religion is like the human skin. We take it wherever we go. Another former congregation, a good friend approached me and said basically the same thing. I'm here. I've got gifts. I've got talents. I'm a creative guy. I'm an advertising guy, a marketing guy. How can you use me in the church? Similar to a question that a young woman asked me not too long ago right here in her own congregation. I'm a creative person. How can you use me in the church? Bob then fully immersed himself in consecutive stewardship campaigns and lit them up with creativity and imagination, resulting in tremendously successful campaigns. You see, in a crowd, Bob too stood out as one who wanted to make a difference. Inherent in the calling of a Christian is a willingness to make a difference in the kingdom of God. Many of you have stepped forward in ways which clearly identify you as a Christian who wants to make a difference. It's woven into the fabric of your life. And you understand that much of your identity is to be derived by what it means to be a Christian. As an example, I know some of you have taken the initiative to invite others to church. You meet them at work. You see them at a tailgate. You see them at a party. You see them at any particular event or function. You see the simple act of inviting someone to church identifies you as a Christian. If you're in that crowd, how would your friends or your associates or anybody else even know you are a Christian if you don't say something that indicates you are a Christian? And finally, if you were to name the greatest sacrifice today that you are making for Christ, what would it be? How would it compare to the other sacrifices that you have made in your life? We make sacrifices for our children. We make sacrifices for our elderly parents. We make sacrifices in our work, in our jobs. We make sacrifices for our education. And many of these sacrifices, we know, require grit, determination, and long hours. But what is it today about your Christian life that distinguishes you, that adds to or enriches the kingdom of God? What sacrifice identifies you with Christ. If someone were to ask you today, what is the greatest sacrifice you make that truly identifies you as a Christian, what would your answer be? What is your sacrifice that honors the Good Friday cross and the repeated images that we see all the time of Jesus carrying his cross to Calvary, all for the sake of you and me? What would that be? I mentioned this before a while ago, but it's appropriate for today. Description over the entrance to the Air Force Academy chapel door reads, entrance, your greatest joy is tied to your greatest sacrifice. Your identity as a Christian is tied to your greatest sacrifice. Pray that will be. May the words of my mouth and meditations